Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, I'm here with Carleton University's Stephanie Carvin. She is also the host of Secure Line podcast.
One of three hosts. So I should
One of
say.
three hosts, yes.
One of three hosts, yes.
The link for that will be in the description below, and she's also got a new Substack there as well. So I figured, because we've got Stephanie here, why don't we start with the national security conversation that is and is not happening during the election.
Right. It's been interesting because I think suddenly there is this kind of interest in kind of the physical security of Canada, right?
Yeah.
And I was just looking at a post that was done. There was a survey that suggested that, the number of people that believe that defense, not national security, defense, we can talk about that distinction in just a second, is an important issue, has gone up from somewhere like the low 50s to like almost 80%.
Wow.
Of Canadians now believe this to be an important issue, right? Which is kind of unprecedented, probably since the Korean War, I would think. So that's probably interesting. And I would differentiate defense being like, again, like kind of the physical security of like the Arctic, being able to have tanks and planes and bases and those kinds of things. Whereas national security is more about like stability and protecting the economic, social, and political stability of the country. And when I think of those kinds of threats, I tend to think of the stuff that's in the CSIS Act, which is violent extremism or terrorism, espionage, and foreign interference, right? Those are kind of the issues. And lately we've been throwing things in there like transnational crime and that kind of stuff. So cyber, of course, would be part of that. So those are the kinds of issues that I tend to specialize in. So those have kind of actually taken a bit of a backseat compared to the defense issues. If you looked at the platforms of all the parties or major parties, and I did that, you can actually see there's quite a bit on defense relative to, I would say, any other election that I can remember. Yeah. And but still very few things on national security, although there are some things there to pick up on.
Yeah, I also think it's interesting because we just spent the last 2 years wailing and gnashing our teeth about foreign interference, and then it just kind of went away in terms of it being an issue. Aside from one or two minor things in this election in terms of what the site task force has said about Chinese posts on WeChat and things like that. But I mean, aside from that, it's the whole issue kind of just evaporated.
Yeah, I was always kind of interested. I mean, to be honest, if we go back and look at the interference, I mean, it was something that Aaron O'Toole spoke about quite a bit when he was the leader of the Conservative Party. And there are MPs in that party who are very interested in this topic, particularly Michael Chong, for obvious reasons. He was targeted by China, right? And he's spoken very passionately about that. James Bazan as well, he the critic. But by and large, I don't think this was an issue that the Conservatives ever wanted to campaign on or make a campaign issue. And we saw that last year when they passed, the Parliament passed Bill C-70, which was effectively the Foreign Interference Act, or an act to counter foreign interference. Was passed within, I think, 45 days, which you look at this stuff more than I do. I mean, that's fast for a 150-page bill.
It's also fast in the context of just how much procedural warfare has happened in the last two parliaments, which drags everything out. So the fact that, 45 days is light speed in recent parliamentary terms.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane. Like, I mean, if you think of Bill C-59, which was a bill that the first Trudeau government introduced back in 2017, it didn't pass until the last days, until literally June 2019 is when it actually passed. It took 2 years for that thing to get through. So when we were looking at this stuff, it went very fast. So, and I think, but the reason for that is this was nothing that the Conservatives wanted to be talking about last summer. Yeah. They're like, we have the Foreign Interference Commission that's making the Liberals look bad. So we're not going to worry about that too much. So you're right. Like, I don't think this was an issue that people that the different, and the Liberals obviously, they don't think they wanted to campaign on it very much because they were the ones at the end of it for 2 years. So I think that's partially it. Now, that being said, foreign interference came up in some really weird ways in like the first week of the election. I ended up talking about foreign interference in ways that I never really thought. There was the story about Pierre Poilievre in India, right? And now anyone who'd read the foreign interference report, it was very clear that Pierre Poilievre had been targeted. His campaign had been boosted, allegedly in intelligence, right?
But from what Justice Hogue was able to decipher.
Yeah, and and so she doesn't say she just said a candidate in the 2022 leadership race, I think it was, and I mean there weren't that many candidates. There weren't that many candidates,
and there was some.
Patrick Brown was not going to be one of them, right?
No, and there was some pretty open chatter about how it was because of Patrick Brown that this had happened.
Potentially, yeah, because he's seen as kind of being closer to the Sikh community in Canada, right?
Yeah, it was like he used to be close to Modi at one point, and then he'd kind of gone away from that, and there was some reprisal aspect about that. So that's kind of what the chatter that was kind of happening around in the open tended to be about.
So exactly. Okay, so there was that aspect of it. That was kind of a surprise the first week. A second surprise was the obviously the Paul Chang situation, where he was telling a joke. It didn't land. It's a fairly serious topic, and unfortunately, the situation was
a joke. Because this is all reported second and third hand.
There's a video actually. You can see it. Yeah, you can see it, and he says, "I'm joking. But it's a severe, we just went through 2 years of this, and the guy has actual threats on his life. This was not an okay thing. So I think this is, I understand why it happened the way it happened. I'm not going to comment further on that. But that was another issue, and that revolves around the issue specifically related to transnational repression. And I think it's important just to remind viewers, that there's kind of two kinds of foreign interference. One is the kind of clandestine operations that are meant to influence people, and the other one is the transnational repression. And that's effectively what Joe Tay, I think his name is, had been experiencing.
Yeah, and so there's that. What Justice Hogue had flagged was the bigger concern in the end was the transnational
disinformation. No, she
actually disinformation, yes, but of the foreign interference, like the transnational repression, kind of the bigger aspect of that than the kind of clandestine stuff.
Right.
Was my understanding. Maybe I misread that, but
she comes out and she thinks going forward that the biggest threat's going to be disinfo. We can talk about that in just a second.
Yeah, for sure.
But I would say the other really weird thing that happened was, of course, the Daniel Smith comments, where I had a lot of people come up and ask me, and they said, "Well, is that foreign interference?" I'm like, because basically she said, "Please, Trump people, knock it off." So because it's making Pierre Poilievre look bad. And people asked me, they said, "Is that foreign interference?" And I said, "No, because it's not clandestine. It wasn't foreign directed, and so for those reasons, it doesn't make the cut." Now, that being said, I think it could invite.
It also doesn't count as treason for all those other viewers as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of my lawyer friends say that treason would probably not master a constitutional. Yeah, it's not constant. Yeah, and it is very specific. It probably wouldn't pass a constitutional test these days. It dates back to the Second World War. So all this to say is that so that wasn't treason. It wasn't a foreign interference. It wasn't a good idea. No. I think, in my view. But I think the concern is maybe, if you wanted to extend a foreign interference concern, is if you think back to 2016 when Trump in the debate says, "Hey, Russia, if you can get those emails, go get them." And then they did. They took that as a green light. And so by inviting foreign interference, you can actually cause foreign interference. So I don't want to say that's actually what happened, but I guess the thing I'll leave with is kind of a good point and a bad point. The one is, I actually think the site task force did a good job. I mean, shout out. I mean, we need to educate the public about these issues and things like that. They came forward with 2 events throughout this election period, which basically suggested that, okay, Canada's still going to have a free and fair election. We're going to be really, really clear about that. But these are two issues we want to, bring your attention to because they are concerning and they've been there. There's inauthentic amplification, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the good news. Where that could be improved is, I think that and this is pointed out to me, that the people who needed to hear this message weren't in the room. And I don't know how you fix this, because the site task force decided to do all of its briefings through the Parliamentary Press Gallery, which I believe you are a member of course.
Yes.
So I don't know how many like small Chinese publications or things like that are members of the Parliamentary
really
Press.
Any. There might be one or two outlets that have membership, but I mean,
Yeah, so like, how do you get those reporters in the room? Especially imagine some of them are like one or two person operations, right? So, and these are the ones that you want reporting on this stuff. And having actually been kicked out of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, I didn't know you couldn't go in there.
Kicked out once. Into the fun theater.
Yeah. So the thing is, like, what's useful, this is like, now we're talking like off topic, but like what's useful about the Parliamentary Press Gallery is, of course, it's like you're like, hey, we're having a briefing, and it's all set up and you just go and it happens. And it's kind of like an arm's length. I can't speak to the relationship between government and the Parliamentary Press Gallery, but there's kind of a relationship.
The gallery is self-governing, but we operate under the auspices of the Speaker of the House of Commons. Right.
So and to that end, I don't know how then. I just worry that some of these smaller outlets that might be about, or have better access to the communities that you want to speak to would not necessarily be able to get access to that room. And I think this is what I would just say is, like, I think what we're seeing is that with every election, this is the third time we've had the site task force. Mm-hmm. With every election, they're getting better and better at what they're doing. But I think this has to be the next evolution. Let's bring in those smaller boutique, foreign language publications.
Yeah. Yeah, and I
don't know how you do that.
The kind of way around that, and there's probably some ability to do that now, but it's probably just not very common for them. Is for them to kind of dial in over Zoom and get registration through the media contacts and so on, so they can participate in that way without actually being full members. But there is a bit of a gatekeeping element so that we don't get inundated by certain disinformation outlets who pose as journalism.
That's what you're talking about.
Not mentioning any names, but I think there's a tension in there. So I think that's what they're going to have to I guess work out with the gallery in terms of how do we invite these outlets to participate in a virtual kind of way, because they're unlikely to fly to Ottawa for those.
No, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
But it's I think it's just a question of creating the access for them. So I think that's certainly something for the site task force to kind of negotiate with the gallery executive on a go forward basis. So.
Okay, so if I could just add then one last thing, maybe to your point about certain disinformation actors and things like that, is one of the concerns I have is, the site task force did a good job of finding and identifying those campaigns that were clearly foreign, that were directed to some purpose by an actor that was foreign. However, I think this is just a very small slice of the pie, mm-hmm. right? And we saw a report today come out in the Financial Times of just the sheer wave of disinformation that Canadians have experienced online in this campaign, that it's favoring one campaign over the other very clearly. A lot of this activity appears to be inauthentically coordinated, and it's Americans who are doing this research. So we have seen a number of reports. Let's see if I can find. There's been several, but. I would direct readers, if they have access, it's expensive, to the Financial Times report, where I think they looked at something like 350,000 messages, and just the level of bias towards one party over the other is very, very clear.
Yeah. I know you tweeted or posted on Bluesky.
Bluesky, yeah.
The links, sorry, not the link, but the graph from that piece around the levels, and it was kind of pretty shocking in terms of how the algorithm torques that. And I did write a piece for the for National Magazine a couple of weeks ago where I talked to the director of the Media Ecosystem Observatory about this kind of behavior.
Taylor Owen?
No.
Or Angus Bridgman?
Angus, yeah.
Both of them are excellent. And people should follow these two on social media. They have just been on this since, for years. And they have been really, really good at trying to track this stuff down.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was just kind of based in terms of, yes, this unauthentic behavior is happening. And I tried to tease a little bit what kind of tools we have, because the Elections Act changes did not pass before the election, and neither did the kind of online harms legislation either. And those would have had some tools that could have flagged some of this stuff, but those didn't pass. And so therefore we're kind of left with other kind of ways of trying to cobble together ways to respond to this. One of the suggestions from someone who'd written an op-ed to National Magazine was to just use the political advertising laws for people who advertise or who promote posts on places like Twitter, or even just extending that to people who buy blue check marks and are
engaged in advocacy,
because you're essentially paying for reach, which is essentially the same as advertising. And so she made that particular argument, and I think it would be up to Elections Canada or the Commissioner of Elections to kind of pursue that. But I think
seems like it would be messy, but it would be interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So
so I think
to look forward to it in any case.
So this is but I just think back to this point, this is the issue. It's like there's foreign interference and there's disinformation, and they're not the same thing.
No.
There is some overlap there, to be sure, but I think one of the problems is you can't. First of all, foreign bots will jump on trends.
Yeah.
And then, so they'll amplify Canadian domestic trends, because the idea is, of course, just to make us all mad at each other online. Yeah. And so we lose faith in each other. We get angry and riled up and all these kinds of things. And so it's hard to kind of distinguish between foreign interference and not foreign interference. There's this really blurry zone. So I do worry that these are things that are just not captured. And that there is this wave of disinformation and no willingness anymore to do anything about it. And in fact, one of the things I really do worry is that, okay, the owner of X/Twitter, it's always gonna be Twitter in my heart, because but has come out and supported one political party over the other. And you also worry that, Elon Musk is a part of an administration that has clearly identified itself with less than democratic states. Yeah. And, so do we have to worry about these kinds of things that is it possible that, Elon Musk could do things to try and mess with our election? Obviously I don't know if that's happened, but some of the FT reporting suggests that at least it's being allowed to happen, even if it's not being actively assisted. And then the final thing that really kind of concerns me about this, and we can maybe move on, but is that in the United States, they've been systematically dismantling all their election integrity institutions, right? Yeah. And so I think that before, if we think, of course, there's a lot of cooperation between the Five Eyes and the, partners, especially, so if the Americans detected some kind of disinformation campaign, they could pass that on to Canada and be like, hey, look, you should look into this. Those institutions are gone. Right. And so it's no longer possible to have, so we may be losing out on some of the intelligence we had. I don't know for sure, but that is certainly a possibility.
Yeah. And I think it's something that we're not actively considering enough in terms of what's happening south of the border and how the spillover effects are really going to be felt in this country.
Yes.
And that's a conversation I've been somewhat frustrated that we're not having in this election. But that's also a much longer conversation, which I don't know if we're going to have time for today.
No, but I mean, I just to your point, I don't know if we can talk about it today, but there's a lot of things that we're going to have to start thinking about, which is that as the United States starts dismantling some of its intelligence infrastructure, and I don't want to sit here and pretend like I'm a massive cheerleader for U.S. intelligence infrastructure. There's clear issues and problems in that, but it's also something we've benefited from, right? Yeah. So we've heard stories about them dismantling certain cybersecurity initiatives, the electoral integrity initiative. They may draw down intelligence sharing. So how are we as Canadians going to be dealing with this? And I think this matters in a lot of ways just as much as it does like building bases and procuring planes and things like this, because, the intelligence ultimately is going to determine what we are aiming those planes at, or what we are, or what we're defending ourselves from, probably more accurately. Yeah. And so I think that this is something that we're going to have to think about and going forward, but also, how do we become more independent in this space, and how should we think about, in some ways, the United States being a less reliable partner generally, and potentially, depending on how things go, possibly even a threat.
Yeah, and that's kind of the conversation nobody really wants to have.
It's like being in a bad science fiction novel right now.
I say a William Gibson prequel, so take your pick, whether it's Neuromancer or The Peripheral, but we're kind of living in the prequel times for those.
Yeah, it's just bizarre. Like the conversations taking place around Ottawa in March were just really, really bizarre, and it is grim. It's very, very grim. I think so. I'm hoping this could change, but I mean, if anyone saw Trump's interview in Time magazine today, I should say, of course, it is April 25th, and when the interview came out. I mean, he's saying, "Look, I'm not trolling Canada. I feel this way. Canada should be part of the United States." He's talking about empire. He's talking like this. This is not good. Yeah. To put it mildly. So it is interesting that national security hasn't featured about this, but I think the anxieties of Canadians are coming out more in terms of the traditional defense issues.
Yeah, for sure. Especially because there's just been so much talk about NATO over the last 2 or 3 years that we're finally kind of getting our act together in terms of doing more of the actual spend that they've been asking. But that goes.
The Secretary General today was saying it's no longer 2%. It's 3%.
Yeah. I was just about to say, like, the goalposts are shifting on that one too.
They're shifting, and again, this is not to advocate for that military spending. I want to be very clear. Like, this comes at the expense of dental care and healthcare and daycare and stuff like that. And people want to cut taxes, and this is tough decisions.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that in mind, I think just to kind of round us off here, this has been a weird election campaign. So I was just wondering if there's anything, just I guess from your perspective, that you've just found weird or interesting about how the last 5 weeks have played out.
I think that's a good question. I just kind of looking at my own family, how much, actually, I don't know if this is weird or not, but like how much they conform to the stereotype. Whereas I have very much the boomers in my family are very, very supporting of Mark Carney, and they see him as a source of stability, and they don't, pardon me, they're unsure about Polyev. They were, a lot of them were willing to vote conservative, right? Which is interesting because they were tired of Justin Trudeau. And they were saying, it's time for change. And now that Carney's come along, they're like, changed. Whereas, the younger people in my family are all voting for Polyev because they're like, it's time for change and things like that. So I don't know if it's weird, but I think it's just kind of interesting to me. I'm like, oh, look, my family's a walking stereotype of the demographics of who's supporting who. Yeah. But it's all been very civil, right? Like it hasn't been, it's at least like that conversation's been in general respect. So I think that's part of it, but I would also, it is interesting that, I guess the final thing I would add, and this is off topic and off brand for me because I don't know what I'm talking about, but something I would love to hear more about in the future, which is that I don't know what the role of policy is in politics.
Yeah,
And
it's
yeah,
kind of diverging in a
right?
really I I I don't want to say an interesting way, but it's almost a yes, this divergence that is happening is really kind of almost disturbing for someone like me who believes that there's a role for policy in politics and that it should be guiding and it should be, helping to shape a vision, and that's been kind of absent.
Yeah, I mean, I think I live in my ivory tower, and I want to be, very very much acknowledge my privilege and things like that. But like, no, for real, like,
Yeah,
but
sure.
I want the policy. So like, tell me what you're gonna do. Like, I'm really curious, which is why I read all the platforms and then kind of looked for the national security content in all of them. And actually, I will say one of the things that's really interesting to me is that in the media, there's this line that actually all of these platforms are very much the same. And I actually no, they're like on national security. There are some clear differences. The Liberals and the NDP are clearly privileging. They talk a lot about protecting 2S LGBTQI plus communities,
Yeah.
whereas obviously the conservative platform is anti-woke, which I have to say would
Yeah,
be
yeah.
not that.
Well, and that was completely absent in there, and the only mention of anything LGBT in the conservative platform was we're gonna keep trans women women's prison.
Men's prison, yeah, women's prison. That was it.
Yeah, yeah,
And there was no, yeah. So that was different. Only the Greens mentioned cyber. Apparently, to be fair, I didn't really read the green one, but my friends did. But and so there's that, and so I think there's like different tones. Okay, so like maybe some of the content was the same, but by and large, I would say the way that the parties would potentially go about it would be different, and that does matter when it comes to national security. So
yeah.
there's that kind of thing. But getting back to the point, it's that people are saying, oh, Carney made a big announcement about defense, and that was kind of off topic, and it didn't really do anything. And I'm like, no, isn't this his job right now
Yeah,
to talk
yeah.
about his policies? So I don't really understand what the relationship of policy to politics is anymore. And
Yeah. Well,
especially as the parties are releasing their platforms like a week before we all vote, and before, like after many of us have already voted.
yeah, yeah. Well, and it was very much that this was an election based on vibes, and as someone who tries to be fairly policy focused in stuff I write, it's really hard to deal with an election that's just vibes.
Just vibes. Yeah. And so yeah, so I think that's this is the cry of the Laurentian elitist over here, I guess, or I don't know, from Oshawa. So I don't know.
Well,
I don't know.
I'm from Alberta, and
Yeah.
feel the same thing. So
So yeah. So it's something that I don't. I think it's probably going to get worse rather than better. But I do think that there is a role for. I remember like growing up in the 90s, and like all my friends who were in politics, they're all interested in policy, and they wanted to talk about policy, and that's all they did. And that just seems to have dissipated. And I'm sorry to see that, because I think ideas are so important to inspiring people
yeah.
and getting people in. But I apparently don't be on TikTok. Bad security.
All right. With that bit of advice, I think we'll leave it there. But thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This was a really great conversation, and
Well, thank you.
we'll talk in the future.
Absolutely. I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about after this election.
Oh, no doubt. All right. Cheers.
Bye.
All right. We're here with Supriya Dwivedi, who almost needs no introduction these days. And where are you? What are you doing these days, Supriya?
Oh, I'm fun employed, Dale. Just enjoying my days, as it were, as a fun employed, now 40-year-old.
Yeah. All right. Well, with this in mind, I figured I would get your thoughts on just how weird this election's been, because it's been weird. And you were close to some of the things that happened preceding it, so I figured you might have some really interesting perspective on how it's all shaken out.
Yeah, I mean, I think weird is the perfect way to sort of describe this election, simply because all of the normal sort of campaign rules that would have applied in elections prior don't really apply when there seems to be one singular focus for the bulk of the Canadian electorate, which is who is going to be the best person to deal with Trump, to stand up to him, to stand up for Canada's sovereignty. And, you know, in previous election cycles where, for example, there would have been quite a bit of coverage on, you know, let's say a terse or tense interaction with a major candidate and members of the press, things sort of get blown over a little bit easier because the news cycle is just jumping so quickly, and you know, it's hard to sort of keep up with the day-to-day insanity, if you'll allow me to use that word, of what's happening in the US. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, even from someone in my position, it was exhausting day after day just to try and keep up with what was going on.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think the other part of the weird aspect to this, you know, to your early foray into this, is the fact that, like, Polyev, for whatever reason, and the Conservatives, like, writ large, have just been pretending like this election isn't all about Trump and isn't about Canadian sovereignty. And it's like they're running the playbook that they had sort of set out for the last, you know, 2 years, which I get it. Their playbook did very well for the moment and the time that we were in then. But it's clear that there needed to be a shift in strategy and messaging and tone, and that for whatever reason, they were either unable or unwilling to do so. And I think that's really where the Liberals have, they've seen their momentum, you know, rise quite rapidly, particularly in comparison to the Conservatives, just going on still about, like, the carbon tax and stuff that, you know, has no importance right now.
Yeah, well, and it was also just there seemed to be a choice that was made that, yes, Trump is there, but the solution is still everything I've been saying all along. So therefore we're not gonna make any changes. Just seemed to me like an interesting decision to have made.
Yeah, especially when the alternative of, you know, some sort of message along the lines of, like, forget about what Carney's saying. Nobody can deal with Trump. This guy is, like, you know, flies by the seat of his own pants. He's not going to respect any of us. What you guys need is somebody who's going to care about all the issues that are affecting us domestically. And, like, I'm going to stand up for Canada, of course, but I'm also going to, you know, insert whatever conservative policy platforms that they want to push. So there was a way to go about it in which you're still focusing on your domestic policy agenda without kind of ceding ground to your main opponent to be the Mr. Anti-Trump right now.
Yeah, well, and there was also times where he's like, Carney thinks he can control Trump, but nobody can control Trump. And then in the next sentence, I'm going to sign a deal with him.
Yeah, like, I know. It's like,
I don't know that works.
I know. And it's like, I don't know if, again, like, if he thinks that folks are just watching his speeches or his rallies in, you know, 20-second sound bites, so they don't get to the second part of that. But yeah, the two definitely don't go together. One thing that was posed to me, you know, about a week and a half ago by a Tory operative, and who's not involved in this current campaign, was that, well, do you ever think that maybe they haven't pivoted because they truly do think they're winning and they truly do think they're, and I think that's a kind of interesting, you know, thought exercise, but that would have to mean that all of literally everything, like all of the polling is quite wrong. So it'll be interesting to see, but that was actually an interesting counterfactual for me because I hadn't considered that.
Yeah, and it does make a certain amount of sense for a certain kind of blinkered mentality, but you would think that there would be someone in the campaign who would be like, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should take this seriously just in case.
Yeah, you would really think that, especially because they were the ones that were clamoring for a campaign for the last year and a half. And then
at least.
And then it comes to them and it's like that they're that, like, dog that caught the car and don't know what to do with it, you know?
Yeah. And with that in mind, that was something I kind of noticed fairly early on in the campaign was everyone knew this was coming. Like, everyone knew that this was coming. They had been screaming for an election for a year and a half. The NDP had been, you know, we're gonna pull the plug. We really mean it this time. We're gonna pull the plug. And then when they pulled the plug, nobody had their nominations in order. Nobody had their policies ready. Like, none of this stuff was ready. And everyone knew this was coming.
It is very bizarre because even my 5-year-old daughter knew that once the red team picked a new leader, we were going to go into an election shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
So it behooves all of us, the fact that there are so many campaign operatives that were simply, I guess, unaware of this reality, and which I guess explains some of the shoddiness we saw, at least in the early days of the campaign when it came to rollout of policies. To you mentioned the nomination of candidates, which was really surprising to me, as well as then you get into all of that kind of really dirty green light versus vetoing a candidate and plunkering down your own folks in certain ridings, and that causes quite a bit of discord, for lack of a better word, within, and it's not the best motivating factor either for your base or for your army of volunteers that you want to go out and to knock doors. And I'm curious about what the morale is for a lot of volunteers on various parties right now, because it has been a weird kind of dragged on election, even though it's been quite short. But I don't know, it just feels like, particularly if you're if you're part of the Carney camp, I mean, very intense, truncated leadership campaign. You get plunked into a national campaign, and there were so many Liberal volunteers that were doing that, throughout the various leadership campaigns that are now onto central or local campaigns, and it's a long slog.
It is. Although fortunately we don't have to deal with the American length of law, but I think they have better ways of dealing with it in terms of they know the rhythms, so that they know how. Anyway. So
really work it out. Yeah.
So other campaign weirdness in this for me was also the NDP conceding early. Like normally they will be, I'm going to be prime minister right up until the very end. And this time it was 2.5 weeks in. He's like, I'm not going to be prime minister, but. And that was another really weird dynamic that I thought was just so unusual for any election in my lifetime.
Well, yeah, and particularly if you're an NDP MP that's running, or a candidate rather that's running, in a riding that you hope to break through into, right? Like think of if you're like the NDP MP in like one of these Toronto ridings where the Liberal incumbent MP in the last election only won by a few hundred or like 1,000 votes or something, and you think your GoTV operation or the moment you can really meet it and push through. I would imagine that Jagmeet's words, that day and then subsequent since have been quite demoralizing for a few of those folks, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens to the NDP after this election if the polling again is correct and they are essentially decimated. I don't know, like there's going to be a lot that's going to be written clearly about Jagmeet Singh's helm him at the helm of the NDP, but I can't imagine that there are too many operatives that are happy with the way things have shaken out, not just in this campaign, but in the lead up to this campaign when, Singh really did make a big deal of him being the ripper of the SACA agreement, and all these things, and how he was going to hold us to account. But I don't know.
Yeah, one of the things I actually think that wasn't really mentioned was the fact that more than a quarter of his caucus decided they weren't running again before the election had even started.
Oh yeah, that's a huge number.
Nobody ever seemed to really talk about that because it was like one after another after another. I'm not running again. And at some point you're kind of like, but that just kind of got glossed over amongst all the other drama that was happening.
Yeah, it really did. And that's, again, in any other election cycle, that would have been a major sort of through line that I think we would have covered and talked about a little bit more. But yeah, just add it to everything falls by the wayside when all we're sort of focused on is Trump madness.
Yeah. With those parties covered off, let's turn to the Liberals. And again, the weirdness in that campaign, which was almost coasting through the election, I would almost say.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's essentially a campaign of don't fuck it up, like this, like that's all it is. Like, as long as there aren't any major mishaps or mistakes that are made, Carney and the Liberals really did have the advantage of running what it would be considered a front runner campaign out the gate. He had good numbers to start. He managed to, up until this point anyway, we'll see what happens on E-Day, but to have his numbers be fairly consistent throughout and to give Liberals the sort of, I think, morale boost, in addition to the actual data momentum that they needed to feel confident, not only going to the doors, but just in like the swag that they have as they're sort of doing these events. And it's so like cliche to say, but if the campaign that is having fun is the campaign that wins, and when you have that kind of attitude going into it, it certainly helps quite a bit.
Yeah, I think that's Paul Well's third rule.
Oh, is it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a third rule, which is the leader who has the best attitude wins. I think is what it is. It's something to that effect. But yeah,
I mean, it's true for a reason, you know.
Yeah, no, for sure. I guess with that in mind, one of the things I talked about with Stephanie Carvin, who's also on this episode, was the fact that policy really took a backseat in this election, and it got to the point where I'm watching talking heads on the political talk shows saying things like, costed platforms are a mistake, we don't really need them anymore, which makes me kind of crazy. But I just wanted to get your thought on this kind of decision that we should run campaigns on vibes and not on ideas.
So I do think it's a terrible idea to run a campaign on vibes and not ideas and not on policy. However,
crazy, but...
yeah, you're not crazy. However, I don't know, like, is there actually an advantage to putting out a costed platform? It's a fair question. It's not one that I would ever, if I was working a back room, would be like, let's not put out a platform. I think policy is important, and I think that's how you differentiate yourselves from the other guys in any sort of election. And you should be forthcoming with voters in terms of what your plan is for the country and how much is going to cost them and how much benefit that they'll receive, from said plan. But ever since Ford's majority government, it was 2018, I think, his first.
Something like that, yeah.
Where they didn't put out a platform that was costed. They, put out little tidbits here and there, but nothing was actually, and he didn't pay any price for it.
Yeah.
And then I think that sort of started seeping into the heads, at least in Ontario strategy folks, that perhaps maybe it's not the best way to do it. And it's like, it's one thing, because you hear this all the time, if you release policy too early, you're basically just giving the other guys a roadmap of what to hit you over the head with. Yeah. So that I certainly understand, but I really do fear for us as a society if we get to a point where really nobody gives a crap about a costed platform, because I think that just makes all of us dumber collectively in a very bad way.
Well, and I think it was kind of important in this election that the Conservatives put out their costed document, and the term is used very loosely, which was full of magical math and overly optimistic assumptions. And that would seem to me a crucial piece of information that voters would want to have if you are parading yourselves around as the good fiscal managers.
Yeah, 100%. But that also goes to show, I think, just how disconnected folks are these days from, vibes and what is put across in terms of feeling and branding versus what's actually contained in folks's, in parties' like policy plans and what they have set forth. Because again, if we were in an information environment where like folks were actually concerned with and we're reading, hard reporting and not just opinion analysis or whatever that happens after the fact, I think we'd be probably in a more informed space. But with the way folks consume information and with the way folks just get little tidbits of things from, as they're scrolling through their regular social media timelines, I don't know. It's like we're in a very different spot now. And I don't know if we can ever go back to the old times. That makes me very depressed even just saying that. Yeah, no,
I feel that deeply in my soul. But the other thing that kind of got me thinking around the fact that when people are saying we don't need platforms is the fact that campaign disinformation is still, a very real reality in this going on. And And we saw things again like Polyev claiming that the carbon tax is coming back. They're just taking it temporarily off, or they resurrected the canard about taxing home equity. And
Ah,
there's stuff I heard about in Whitby where there's flyers going around claiming that the Liberals are going to tax churches and things like that. And I mean, these are things that, a platform document would help to dispel in a better information environment. But when people are saying we don't need them, and then at the same time this kind of campaign disinformation is happening, it seems to me that there's something that we should be connecting there.
yeah, I mean, definitely. And then add to that, to your point about the campaign mis and disinformation and just what's out there, it's all seems to be exacerbated by our current algorithmic environment. There was a recent analysis by the Financial Times with work done by the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which is a joint operation by U of T and McGill, looking at just where the tilt was in terms of bias, right wing or left wing. And they found a predominant right-wing bias for pro-Polyev content on Twitter anyway. And it's just, or X, I guess now.
Oh, we call it Twitter.
yeah, okay. So it's just this, it's bad. And then you consider, the algorithmic tilting of things, and it just gets that much worse. So, I mean, yes, like campaign platforms are definitely would inoculate against that. But, if you're the type of person to take as gospel some sort of meme or some shit post about the Liberals taxing your home equity, which is something that gets trotted out all the time,
Every
right?
single election.
Yeah, or like the example you used in Whitby about churches, like, would you be convinced by a Liberal platform document saying that that's not the case? I don't know. Like that's also a part of this giant problem societally is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's kind of the flip side of that too, is, I mean, you can have all the information out there and people will still believe the disinformation, because disinformation is a supply side problem. Sorry, a demand side problem, and not
not a supply side problem. Yeah.
All right. I think we'll leave it there. But thanks for the chat, and we will do this again in the near future.
Yeah, with a new government.
Yeah. Well, technically, possibly the same government. So.
But there's going to be new people in it, right? So yes. Anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll end that on my pedantic note. But thanks again.
No, thank you.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.